We had to leave the other one plugged in there, so we're recording on this one. We are reading from the Great Victorians, Columbia University, book number 14. David Copperfield and Peggotty. Pedagogy. Alright, we're reading from the beginning. The Great Victorians, the Victorian era. Alexa, play reading classical music.
The station, Classical Focus, free on Amazon Music.
It is difficult to assign a definite date to the beginning of a great period, since the causes ultimately responsible for an obvious change in national life are manifold and complex. They are to be found in process of germination long before they make their appearance, as freely and actively influential, and they are sometimes so inextricably mingled with the last reluctant phases of a preceding age that it is difficult to recognize at once their new significance and their constructive potency. For the Victorian era, it is particularly hard to find a definite date by which to mark its commencement. The poets of the Romantic movement who were latest born had died earliest. Keats in 1821, Shelley 1822, Byron 1824, and even those who, like Wordsworth and Coleridge, lingered on to length of mortal years, had left behind them their visions of immortality, the inspiration of their young romanticism, and the fervor of their earlier emotion by the time the 19th century had passed its first quarter. Queen Victoria came to the throne in the year 1837, but perhaps greater advantages attached to the year 1832 has an arbitrary point at which to begin a consideration of this new period in the history of English literature. It was then that Scott, the greatest romancer of a great romantic period, died at Abbotsford, and in the same year Germany saw the end of Goethe, France the death of Cuvier. The old age was passing. The date also marks the publication of Tennyson's early lyrics, in which the characteristics of the first period of Victorian poetry manifest themselves. In 1833, Browning published Pauline, and Dickens began his career with sketches by Boz. The new age was on the way. In previous volumes, we have endeavored to show that each age has its dominant characteristics. The 18th century was a period that prided itself upon the brilliance of its wit and the bitterness of its satire. The period of Romanticism which followed went to the opposite extreme and generously indulged itself in emotion which knew no limitations. Instead of sanitizing the prominent and the great, Instead of satirizing the prominent and the great, as did the hard-hitting writers of the 18th century, the poets of Romanticism loved and revered the obscure and the lowly. Instead of the freedom of speech upon which their predecessors had prided themselves, these poets of new emotions set up for themselves the tolerant idol of personal freedom, and about this shrine they revealed in an orgy of self-indulgent worship. The next age, which is perhaps best characterized as the Victorian era, involved a not unusual reaction toward rationalism, perhaps as a transplanted outgrowth of the principles underlying the French Revolution, with its deification of human reason. Together with this familiar tendency to elevate the process of human thought, when Hierethro undreamed expansion of the field of human knowledge, which implied a revolution in man's point of view with regard to the world, and which substituted for the egocentric microcosm of the romanticist the infinite vistas of the evolutionary theory. This age then tended to be critical not only of the phenomena of life, but also of the philosophic ideas which had hitherto helped to determine human action. The enormous development of machinery and industry, too, tended to encourage that materialism of outlook which is apparently never far below the surface of modern life. In contrast, and even in contradiction with the breadth and depth of their intellectual life has its philosophic questionings, the Victorians seem to be curiously limited in some of their points of view, and to have narrow opinions and restricting conventions out of place in an age whose chief characteristic is an unprecedented expansion of human knowledge. It is as if, like Bacon, the Victorians had taken all knowledge to be their province, and yet in their effort to trace the utmost limits of their new domain, had forgotten how to live themselves. To take life as seriously as did Ruskin and Carlyle is to forget that we are living in the midst of such a human comedy as did not escape the wider outlook of Moliere and Medrith. This criticism, however, more accurately refers to the abiding element of conservatism in English life and letters, and it is not to be regarded as a description of the pioneers of New Thought or the workers on the advanced line of 19th century civilization. More of the revolts against Victorianism were initiated by the rebels of the Victorian era. This restriction of outlook refers particularly to the Victorian mass mind in its narrow scope and to that type of critic or reader, only too common in the Victorian era, whose literary creed magnified two tenets or taboos above all else: above charity to his fellows, openness to the light, or fidelity to the truth. For there were two things which beyond all other things were tabooed in Victorian literature. The first taboo was against full and frank treatment of such relations of man and women as went beyond the very narrow circle of what these Puritan critics regarded as lawful and proper. And in no age perhaps has the error of legality. Alexa Volume 1 has the area of legality and propriety been narrower or been more jealously observed than in the Victorian age, and the attempt to preserve the sanctity of the British home, this unwritten law personified as Miss Grundy, restricted or tired to restrict the literary interests of adult readers to those regarded as settled for Victorian maidens in their teens. The second taboo was inspired by the reactionary tendencies of the apprehensive philosophy and religion of the day, and attempted to prevent the new scientific discoveries with their consequent broadening of the human outlook. From affecting what was considered a radical revision of human belief and a disastrous reconstruction of human society, this latter struggle, one of the keenest in the history of human thought, includes very different but equally sincere exponents of various points of view, such as Tennyson, from whose heart came the ultimate hope expressed in the Memoriam, Cardinal Newman, whose clear simplicity of faith and deep conviction are to be felt in every page of his Apologia, and Spencer, Darwin, Huxley, and Tyndall, the protagonists of the new evolutionary point of view. Alexa, Volume 5. Alexa, Volume 4. In spite of the predominant influence of science in the intellectual and in the industrial life of the nation, the prevailing literary interests are still fiction and poetry, though every kind of writing has its exponents. So great indeed is the volume of Victorian literature that it becomes extraordinarily difficult to pick out the best or the permanent. The incorrigible prolixity of the writers of this age is something that cannot fail to impress even the leisurely reader. Even minor writers produced a quantity as great as the total output of Shakespeare, and the complete editions of such writers as Ruskin, Dickens, and Thackeray would have been inconceivable in an earlier and less voluble age. Lacking the stimulus of the Victorian public and the modern printing press, this very profusion of creative expansion involves on the part of the critic a somewhat more strict and demanding attitude and the judgment of voluminous writers that he would assume in the case of the more restricted compositions of an earlier day. For when a poet or a novelist sets no limit for himself, then he must necessarily be judged, so far as that is humanly possible, sub specie artenitatis, sub specie artenitatis. From this universal point of view, Dickens and Thackeray seem unnecessarily diffuse and prolix. Tennyson and Browning often fall short in their best, and Swinburne soon cloys, cloys, cloys. One notes also in studying the literature of this period that it is an age in which women become vocal, instead of the few and scattered singers or storytellers whom we found in the Romantic period. We now have numerous writers of the second rank, in both poetry and prose, whose prophecy of the larger work that women are to do in literature of the 19th century. Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christina Rossetti in poetry, and Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot in fiction, are the literary leaders of the movement, which grows increasingly powerful and significant as the years go by. But this is a phenomena of social and political as well as of literary significance, part of a general movement of emancipation. If one were to attempt to condense into a single sentence the broad characteristics, emancipation, I said it right, broad characteristics of the life of the Victorian age, one would say perhaps that they consisted of a gradual enfranchisement of the political and economic life of England and of a protected and severe struggle for freedom of thought and expression. These difficult strands are inextricably I need to take a sip of water. All the irony. These different strands are inextricably woven together in the life of the period, and it is only for the sake of convenience and clearness in presentation that we now proceed to consider the advance in this age made in civilization under the four following heads. Alright, so we're going to pause there on page 4, and we'll continue our reading later. We need a bookmark. For that, we go to our deck of everything, pickle everything, no court needed. The best word came after. Alright, so we pick a random one here. The lines on the core are getting faded and not easy to see. I need to get something to repair them. Paint, tackle, paint, pickle, paint, pickle.